It's nearly 2 in the morning on June 17, 1972. Frank Wills, a security guard at the Watergate complex in Washington, makes his rounds through the parking garage. He's worked this shift dozens of times before, checking doors, making sure everything's secure. But tonight, something catches his eye. There's tape on a door lock. Not just any tape, it's holding the lock open. Frank pulls it off, figures maybe a maintenance crew forgot to remove it, and continues his rounds. But when he comes back around 20 minutes later, the tape's back. Someone's retaped the lock. Frank doesn't hesitate. He calls the police. Within minutes, 3 plainclothes officers arrive at the Watergate. They take the elevator up to the 6th floor, to the offices of the Democratic National Committee. Moving quietly through the darkened offices, they spot them. 5 men, wearing business suits and surgical gloves, carrying sophisticated bugging equipment and rolls of $100 bills. The burglars surrender without a fight. It's just another break-in, the officers think. They book the men and head home. The story might have ended there, buried in the police blotter, forgotten by Monday. Just 5 guys caught red-handed, nothing more. But this wasn't just any break-in, and those weren't just any burglars. Within hours, reporters would discover that one of them worked as security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president. Within days, they'd trace money in the burglars' possession directly back to Richard Nixon's campaign. Within 2 years, this botched burglary would bring down a president and forever change American politics. Nobody knew it that night in the Watergate garage. Not Frank Wills, who'd just made the most important call of his life. Not the 5 burglars who thought they were untouchable. And certainly not the President of the United States, who'd wake up to news that would eventually destroy his presidency. This is the story of Watergate. To understand Watergate, you need to understand Richard Nixon. And to understand Nixon, you need to go back before he was president, before the power, before the paranoia took complete hold. Nixon lost the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy by one of the narrowest margins in history. He was convinced, without evidence, that Kennedy had somehow stolen the election. That loss ate at him. 2 years later, he lost again, this time running for governor of California. The morning after that defeat, he held a press conference that became legendary for all the wrong reasons. "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," he told the assembled reporters. Most political observers thought his career was finished, but Nixon staged one of the most remarkable comebacks in American politics. In 1968, he won the presidency. You'd think that would have satisfied him, given him confidence. Instead, he brought something darker into the White House, a deep suspicion of enemies, real and imagined, everywhere around him. By 1971, Nixon's administration was building what they called an enemies list. His counsel, John Dean, wrote a memo that laid it out plainly. The goal was to use the available federal machinery to screw our political enemies. The list eventually grew to include hundreds of names: politicians, journalists, actors, activists, academics. Paul Newman made the list. So did a Washington Post columnist who wrote what they called daily hate Nixon articles. The administration tried repeatedly to weaponize the Internal Revenue Service against these perceived enemies. They wanted tax audits launched, wanted the full power of the federal government turned against people who oppose them. Fortunately, IRS Commissioner Donald Alexander refused to cooperate. But the intent was clear. Nixon saw the presidency as a weapon to be used against opponents. This paranoia intensified after Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers in June 1971. These were top-secret documents about the Vietnam War, and their publication in the New York Times infuriated Nixon. In response, the White House created a special unit called the Plumbers. Their job was to plug leaks and do whatever dirty work needed doing. In September 1971, the Plumbers broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, searching for files that might discredit him. This was no sanctioned law enforcement operation. This was the White House, ordering a burglary to destroy a political enemy. But the Plumbers got frustrated. They weren't getting enough assignments, weren't being used enough. They wanted action. By early 1972, most of them had been reassigned to the Committee to re-elect the President, known by the unfortunate acronym CREEP. One of the key figures was G. Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent with big plans and bigger ambitions. In January 1972, Liddy presented a campaign intelligence plan to the committee. It was extensive, elaborate, and entirely illegal. It included breaking into opponents' offices, planting bugs, even kidnapping protest leaders during the Republican convention. The plan was scaled back, but not abandoned, and one of the targets was obvious: the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. Here's what makes this particularly interesting. By the spring of 1972, Nixon's re-election looked almost certain. The Democrats were in disarray. George McGovern, who'd eventually become their nominee, was trailing badly in every poll. Nixon didn't need to cheat to win. He was going to win anyway, probably by a landslide. But that wasn't enough. The paranoia, the need to control everything, the conviction that enemies lurked everywhere, it drove them to take risks they didn't need to take. On May 28, 1972, the first Watergate break-in occurred. The burglars successfully entered the DNC offices and planted wiretaps. But the bugs didn't work properly. The information they provided was useless, so they decided to go back. That decision, to return to the Watergate for a second break-in, would change American history, because the second time they got caught. When word reached the White House on the morning of June 17th that 5 men had been arrested at the Watergate, the immediate reaction was damage control. The burglars weren't talking, at least not initially, but there were problems, big problems. The burglars were carrying thousands of dollars in cash. They had sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment. And most damaging of all, one of them was James McCord, the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president. The connection to Nixon's campaign was immediate and undeniable. Within days, 2 young Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started digging into the story. Most of the press treated it as a minor incident, a curiosity that would fade. But Woodward and Bernstein sensed something bigger, and they had help. A source Woodward called Deep Throat, who'd prove crucial to unraveling the scandal. On June 19th, just 2 days after the break-in, Deep Throat gave Woodward a critical piece of information. He told him that E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA agent who worked at the White House, was involved. Hunt's phone number had been found in one of the burglars' address books. This wasn't just some random break-in. This went straight to the Nixon White House. Meanwhile, Nixon was already orchestrating the cover-up. On June 23rd, less than a week after the arrests, Nixon met with his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, in the Oval Office. They had a problem. The FBI was investigating, and their investigation was leading in dangerous directions. Nixon and Haldeman discussed a plan. They'd use the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. This conversation was recorded on Nixon's secret taping system. Years later, when that tape was finally released, it became known as the smoking gun, the definitive proof that Nixon was directing the cover-up from the very beginning. But in June 1972, nobody knew about those tapes. The cover-up continued. The White House immediately went into spin mode. Press Secretary Ron Ziegler dismissed the break-in as a third-rate burglary attempt. In August, Nixon gave a speech swearing that his White House staff wasn't involved. Most Americans believed him. And in November 1972, Nixon won re-election in one of the biggest landslides in American political history. He took more than 60% of the vote, crushing George McGovern. To most observers, the Watergate break-in seemed like a footnote, a minor scandal that hadn't mattered. The president's men thought they'd gotten away with it. But Woodward and Bernstein kept digging, and Deep Throat kept talking. In September, the reporters learned that John Mitchell, Nixon's former attorney general and his campaign manager, had controlled a secret fund used to finance intelligence operations against Democrats. When Bernstein called Mitchell for comment, Mitchell exploded. He threatened both Bernstein and Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Post. The reporters printed Mitchell's threat word for word. In October, just before the election, Woodward and Bernstein published what they called a blockbuster story. The Watergate break-in wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage, conducted on behalf of Nixon's re-election and directed by White House officials. The White House fought back hard. They accused the Post of conducting a vendetta against the president. They claimed it was just one liberal newspaper making wild accusations, and largely their spin worked. Most Americans either didn't believe the allegations or didn't care enough to change their votes. But underneath the surface, the cover-up was starting to crack. Nixon and his aides were offering money to the burglars to stay quiet. Hush money paid to ensure their silence. They were coordinating stories, coaching witnesses, doing everything possible to keep the truth buried. On January 30th, 1973, all 5 burglars, plus G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord, were convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and wiretapping. The trial was supposed to be the end of it. The president's men thought that once the convictions came down, everyone would move on. They were wrong, because James McCord wasn't ready to take the fall alone. In March, he wrote a letter to Judge John Sirica, who'd presided over the trial. In that letter, McCord revealed that there'd been political pressure applied to the defendants to plead guilty and stay silent. He said perjury had been committed at the trial. Most importantly, he said higher-ups were involved. McCord's letter blew the cover-up wide open. Suddenly, Watergate wasn't just about 5 burglars. It was about the White House itself. Judge Sirica read McCord's letter in open court. The news exploded across the country. Within weeks, the Senate announced it would hold hearings. Attorney General Richard Kleindienst resigned. Nixon's top 2 aides, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, resigned. White House counsel John Dean was fired. Dean was particularly dangerous to Nixon. He'd been in the room for many of the cover-up discussions. He knew where the bodies were buried. And when the Senate investigation began, he started talking. On June 3, 1973, newspapers reported that Dean had told investigators he'd discussed the Watergate cover-up with President Nixon at least 35 times. The president wasn't just aware of the cover-up, he'd been directing it. On May 18, 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee began its televised hearings. Americans across the country tuned in, watching as witness after witness testified about what had happened. The hearings became appointment television. People organized their days around watching them. John Dean testified for days, providing devastating detail about the cover-up. But it was still his word against the president's. Without hard evidence, Nixon might survive. Then came July 16, 1973. Alexander Butterfield, a White House aide, was testifying before the committee. Almost as an afterthought, someone asked if there was any way to corroborate what people had said in meetings with the president. Butterfield paused. Then he dropped a bombshell. "Yes," he said. "There was a taping system in the Oval Office. Every conversation, every meeting, everything said in the president's presence. It was all recorded." The room went silent. Committee members looked at each other in disbelief. If those tapes existed, they'd prove everything. They'd show exactly what Nixon knew and when he knew it. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox immediately subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon refused to hand them over. He claimed executive privilege, the president's right to keep certain communications confidential. The courts would have to decide. Cox was a fascinating choice for special prosecutor. He was a Harvard law professor with no prosecutorial experience. But he had something more valuable than experience. He had absolute integrity. He was a direct descendant of Roger Sherman, who'd signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He'd been Solicitor General under President Kennedy. He was exactly the kind of person who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be convinced to look the other way. Nixon hated him for it. The legal battle over the tapes dragged on for months. In October 1973, the Court of Appeals ruled against Nixon. The president had to turn over the tapes, but Nixon wasn't done fighting. He proposed what became known as the Stennis Compromise. Senator John Stennis of Mississippi would review the tapes and provide summaries to Cox's office. There was just one problem. Stennis was elderly, notoriously hard of hearing, and recovering from being shot earlier that year. Asking him to review hours of tapes and accurately report their contents seemed, at best, unrealistic. Cox refused the compromise. On October 19th, he held a press conference to explain his position. It happened to be a Saturday afternoon when fewer football games than usual were on television. More people watched Cox's press conference than might have otherwise. They saw his integrity, his conviction, his unwillingness to compromise on the truth. Americans connected with him. That evening, Nixon decided Cox had to go. He ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire the special prosecutor. Richardson refused. He'd promised Congress when Cox was appointed that he wouldn't interfere. He resigned instead. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Finally, Nixon turned to Solicitor General Robert Bork, now the highest-ranking official left at the Justice Department. Bork carried out the order. On Saturday evening, October 20th, 1973, Archibald Cox was fired. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Telegrams poured into the White House and Congress, so many that Western Union was overwhelmed. Most demanded Nixon's impeachment. For the first time in the scandal, a plurality of Americans said they supported removing the president from office. The press dubbed it the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon had overplayed his hand. Instead of ending the investigation, he'd intensified it. Within days, Congress began drafting impeachment resolutions. A new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, was appointed, and the pressure to release the tapes grew stronger. But Nixon still resisted. In November, the White House revealed something that made the situation even worse. One of the key tapes from June 20th, 1972, just 3 days after the break-in, had an 18.5-minute gap. Someone had erased part of the recording. Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, claimed she'd accidentally erased a few minutes while transcribing. But 18.5 minutes? Nobody believed it. By April 1974, the House Judiciary Committee formally began impeachment proceedings. Nixon tried one more gambit. He'd release edited transcripts of the tapes rather than the tapes themselves. On April 30th, the White House made public more than 1,200 pages of transcripts, but they were edited, and people wanted the actual tapes, not the White House's version of what was on them. The transcripts that were released showed a president who was crude, calculating, and deeply involved in covering up crimes. Even with the editing, they were damaging. The legal battle continued. Special Prosecutor Jaworski subpoenaed 64 tapes. Nixon refused. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, 8-0, with Justice Rehnquist recusing himself. Nixon had to turn over the tapes. There was no more room to maneuver, no more appeals, no more delays. By late July 1974, the House Judiciary Committee was debating specific articles of impeachment. The committee included both Democrats and Republicans, and the televised debates were watched by millions of Americans. One member in particular stood out. Barbara Jordan, a freshman congresswoman from Texas, delivered a speech that stirred the nation. She spoke about the Constitution, about what it meant to be an American, about why this mattered. People who'd never heard of her became transfixed by her words. On July 27th, the committee passed the first article of impeachment, obstruction of justice. On July 29th, they added abuse of power. The next day, they added contempt of Congress. The vote wasn't just Democrats. Republicans on the committee voted yes, too. Nixon was running out of options, he was running out of allies, and he was running out of time. On August 5th, the White House finally released the tape from June 23, 1972, the smoking gun tape. It proved everything. It showed Nixon and Haldeman just 6 days after the break-in, planning how to use the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation. It showed the president directing the cover-up from the very beginning. Even Republicans who defended Nixon throughout the scandal couldn't ignore this. The tape was clear, unambiguous, damning. Some of his strongest supporters in Congress called the evidence devastating. On August 7th, 3 senior Republicans went to the White House. Senator Barry Goldwater, the party's 1964 presidential nominee. House Minority Leader John Rhodes. Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott. They met with Nixon and gave him the news. The votes weren't there. The House would impeach him. The Senate would convict him. It was over. Nixon had one choice left: resign or be impeached and removed from office. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He looked tired. His presidency, which had achieved genuine accomplishments in foreign policy and other areas, was ending in disgrace. "I have never been a quitter," Nixon said. "To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interest of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow." The next morning, August 9th, Nixon said goodbye to his staff in an emotional, rambling speech. Then he walked out to the helicopter on the White House lawn. He turned, gave his trademark victory sign with both arms raised, and climbed aboard. The helicopter lifted off and carried him away. At noon, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. "Our long national nightmare is over," Ford said. "Our Constitution works." But the story didn't quite end there. On September 8th, President Ford issued a full and unconditional pardon for Richard Nixon. Ford said it was in the best interest of the country, that the nation needed to move forward rather than spend years prosecuting a former president. The pardon was deeply controversial. Many Americans felt cheated. They wanted Nixon to face justice, wanted him to be held accountable like anyone else. The pardon almost certainly cost Ford the 1976 presidential election. Others close to Nixon didn't escape. John Mitchell served 19 months in prison. H.R. Haldeman served 19 months. John Ehrlichman served 18 months. G. Gordon Liddy served 4.5 years. More than 40 government officials were indicted or jailed in connection with Watergate. Nixon himself never admitted wrongdoing. He spent the rest of his life, he died in 1994, maintaining that his only mistake was not acting more decisively. He never said he was sorry for the crimes. He never acknowledged the full scope of what he'd done. Watergate changed America in ways we're still feeling today. The scandal left marks on our politics, our journalism, our trust in government, and our understanding of presidential power. First, there's the immediate political impact. The 1974 midterm elections became a bloodbath for Republicans. They lost 4 Senate seats and 48 House seats. An entire generation of young Democrats swept into Congress. They were called Watergate babies. They arrived with a mission to clean up Washington, to restore integrity to government. But beyond the electoral consequences, Watergate transformed how we think about the presidency itself. Before Watergate, the office carried enormous prestige. Presidents made mistakes, certainly, but there was a baseline assumption of integrity. Watergate shattered that assumption. It showed that a president could lie repeatedly, could use the powers of the office to pursue personal vendettas, could engage in criminal activity and try to cover it up. Congress responded by passing a series of laws designed to prevent another Watergate. The Privacy Act of 1974 restricted government surveillance of citizens. Campaign finance laws were strengthened. The Inspector General system was expanded to provide oversight of federal agencies. These weren't perfect solutions. Money found other ways into politics. Surveillance authorities grew in later decades. But they represented a genuine effort to address the abuses that Watergate had exposed. The scandal also changed journalism. Before Watergate, many reporters had a relatively cozy relationship with politicians. There was an understanding that some things stayed off the record, that some questions weren't asked. Watergate ended that era. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein became heroes to a generation of young journalists. They'd shown that aggressive, persistent reporting could bring down the most powerful person in the country. Suddenly, journalism schools were flooded with applicants who wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein. But this created its own problems. The trust between the press and politicians, which had been strained, largely collapsed. Every scandal, no matter how small, became a potential gate. Soon we had Irangate, Monica-gate, even Deflategate. The suffix -gate became shorthand for scandal, used around the world. While aggressive investigative reporting served the public interest, the constant search for the next Watergate sometimes led to overreach, to stories that inflated minor controversies into major crises. And here's something most people don't know about one of Watergate's heroes. Mark Felt, Deep Throat, had his own complicated story. His identity remained secret for more than 30 years. Not until 2005, when he was 91 years old, did he reveal that he'd been Woodward's source. By then, he was suffering from dementia, and it was his daughter who convinced him to go public. When the revelation came, reaction was mixed. Many celebrated him as a hero who'd saved the Republic, but others, including some conservatives who'd worked for Nixon, condemned him. They said he should have gone through proper channels, should have reported his concerns to prosecutors or Congress rather than leaking to the press. They had a point about process, even if they were wrong about the larger picture. And there's an irony to Felt's story. In 1980, he was convicted of authorizing illegal break-ins at the homes of people associated with the Weather Underground, a domestic terrorist group. The charges involved civil rights violations. Essentially, he'd ordered the kind of abuse of power that Watergate had exposed. President Reagan pardoned him in 1981. So the man who helped bring down a president for authorizing break-ins was himself convicted of authorizing break-ins. History is complicated. Heroes are complicated. Felt was both the man who preserved democracy and a man who violated civil rights. Both things can be true simultaneously. Watergate also revealed the crucial importance of Frank Wills, the security guard whose alertness started everything. He called the police when he noticed that retaped lock. Without him, the burglars might have succeeded, and we might never have learned about the break-in or everything that followed. But Wills never profited from his role. He struggled financially for years and died in poverty in 2000. History sometimes remembers the powerful and forgets the ordinary people whose actions matter just as much. Perhaps the most important legacy of Watergate is the principle it established, that the president is not above the law. Nixon claimed executive privilege. He argued that the presidency required secrecy, that he couldn't be investigated like an ordinary citizen. The courts rejected that argument. The Supreme Court unanimously said no, the president must comply with subpoenas just like anyone else. That principle has held through subsequent scandals. When President Clinton was investigated in the 1990s, when questions arose about other administrations, the Watergate precedent remained. The president has special responsibilities and special powers, but not immunity from the law. But we should be honest about the limits of Watergate's legacy, too. Nixon's pardon meant he never faced criminal prosecution. The system worked in removing him from office, but it didn't work in holding him fully accountable. And in later years, when presidential scandals emerged, the lessons of Watergate sometimes seemed forgotten. Abuses of power continued, just in different forms. Trust in government, which declined sharply during Watergate, never fully recovered. In 1964, more than 70% of Americans said they trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time. By 1974, that number had fallen below 40%. Today, it's even lower. Watergate didn't create that decline by itself. Vietnam, later scandals, and other factors all played roles, but it was a major turning point. So, what should we take from Watergate today? First, that democracy is fragile. It depends on people choosing to do the right thing even when the wrong thing would be easier or more profitable. It depends on security guards who notice taped locks, on judges who rule against presidents, on journalists who keep digging when everyone tells them to stop. Second, that power absolutely does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Nixon won 49 states in 1972. He had every reason to be confident, but it wasn't enough. The paranoia, the enemies lists, the conviction that opposition was treasonous, these impulses led him to authorize crimes he didn't need to commit. Third, that the cover-up is often worse than the crime. The break-in was serious, but Nixon might have survived it. What destroyed him was lying about it, obstructing justice, using presidential power to prevent investigation. He turned a scandal into a constitutional crisis. Fourth, that institutions matter. When Nixon told the Attorney General to fire the special prosecutor, the Attorney General resigned instead. When the Supreme Court ordered Nixon to release the tapes, he complied rather than defy the court. The system worked, barely, and only because people chose to defend it. And finally, that citizenship requires vigilance. Frank Wills, the night guard, could have ignored that tape on the door. The Post could have dropped the story after the election. Judge Sirica could have accepted the first Watergate trial at face value. At each point, people chose to pay attention, to ask questions, to demand accountability. Watergate showed us the best and worst of American democracy, the capacity for corruption and the capacity for correction. It reminded us that no one is above the law and that democracy requires active participation, not passive acceptance. The Constitution works, Ford said, but only if people make it work. That was the lesson of Watergate. That remains the lesson today.